In the late 8th century, in the Norse settlement of Kattegat, a simple farmer named Ragnar Lothbrok begins to dream of exploring lands to the west. While most Viking raids traditionally head east toward the Baltic regions, Ragnar believes there is something greater waiting across the sea, together with his eccentric and brilliant shipbuilder friend Floki. He constructs a revolutionary longship, capable of withstanding the harsh open ocean. When Ragnar asks the local ruler, Earl Haraldsson, for permission to sail west to an unknown land called England, he is denied. But Ragnar is determined. Defying the Earl's orders, he secretly gathers a small crew that includes his fierce wife, Ligortha, a skilled shield maiden, and sets sail into uncharted waters. They reach the shores of Lindisfarne, a Christian monastery, and raid it, successfully killing monks, seizing treasure, and capturing a monk named Athelstan will become deeply significant later in the story. Upon returning to Kattegat with wealth and stories of a fertile land, Ragnar becomes a local hero, but also a threat to Haraldsson's authority. Tensions grow as Haraldsson sees Ragnar's popularity rise. Eventually, this leads to open conflict between the two. Ragnar challenges and defeats Haraldsson in a deadly duel, claiming the title of Jarl for himself. With that victory, Ragnar steps out of obscurity and begins a path toward greatness, not just as a warrior, but as a legend of Viking history. Ragnar Lothbrok's life as a ruler begins with glory, but quickly turns turbulent. After defeating Earl Haraldsson and claiming the title of Jarl, he doesn't rest. He believes the future of the Norse people lies not just in survival, but expansion. With newfound power, Ragnar starts planning larger raids into new parts of England, especially Wessex, a kingdom far richer and more organized than the monastery he previously plundered. But even as he dreams of distant conquests, the cost of ambition begins to show at home. Ligortha, his wife and companion in battle, starts to feel sidelined. Though she supports Ragnar's mission, their marriage begins to crack under the weight of prophecy and betrayal. A seer tells Ragnar he will father many sons more than Ligortha can bear. When Ragnar meets the mysterious Princess Aslaug, and she becomes pregnant with his child, it confirms the prophecy but shatters his family. Ligortha leaves Kattegat, taking young Bjorn with her, and Ragnar is left to question if the price of greatness is loneliness. Athelstan, the Christian monk, taken as a slave, continues to play a unique role in Ragnar's life as a former priest. He represents everything the Vikings don't understand and everything they fear about the Christian world. Yet Ragnar is drawn to him, not just for his knowledge, but because Athelstan challenges his beliefs. The two grow closer, and Ragnar begins to see beyond the gods he's always worshipped. Athelstan, too, is transformed. Though tormented by visions and guilt, he slowly embraces elements of Norse culture. Caught between two religions, two worlds, and, eventually, two kings. Meanwhile, political unrest brews. Ragnar's brother Rollo, a fierce warrior, grows envious. He fights beside Ragnar but lives in his shadow. The relationship, once unbreakable, begins to fracture. Rollo desires recognition, identity, and power, and others begin to exploit that. Ragnar tries to keep him close, but Rollo's insecurities are fueled by whispers and manipulation. In the wider world, King Horik of Denmark allies with Ragnar for a massive invasion of Wessex. Together, they assemble a great fleet and sail for the English coast. What begins as a victorious campaign soon becomes complicated. King Ecbert of Wessex, intelligent and diplomatic, doesn't just fight with swords, he fights with strategy. Ecbert reaches out to Ragnar, offering land and peace in exchange for cooperation. Ragnar, more thoughtful than other Viking leaders, considers it. But Horik wants total conquest, not negotiation. Quiet tension begins to divide the Norse forces. As the raiding continues, alliances become fragile. Ragnar sees opportunity in diplomacy, land for settlement, coexistence, even legacy. But Horik sees weakness and talks, and accuses Ragnar of becoming soft, even traitorous. This division comes to a head when Ragnar is forced to choose between blind loyalty to Horik or a new vision for the Viking future. Meanwhile, Rollo's jealousy almost drives him to betray Ragnar, but in a moment of clarity, he returns to his brother's side, though the damage is already done. Tensions escalate further when a former ally, Jarl Borg, returns with vengeance in his heart. After being betrayed, Borg attacks Kattegat while Ragnar is away. People suffer, the city falls temporarily, and Ragnar must retake it. When he does, he captures Borg and performs the legendary Blood Eagla, brutal execution ritual reserved for traitors. The scene is unforgettable, a statement that betrayal among Norsemen will never be forgiven. Back in England, Athelstan is captured by Saxon soldiers and tortured as a heretic. His faith is torn apart. When he's finally rescued by Ragnar, he's no longer the same man. He carries scars both physical and spiritual, and his place in the story becomes more complicated. Athelstan is now a man of two faiths, belonging fully to neither. The final act of the season sees King Horik plotting Ragnar's death. He believes Ragnar's vision threatens the old way of things. But Ragnar, always the visionary, is ahead of him. He quietly gains the loyalty of Horik's closest warriors, including Floki, whose apparent betrayal is revealed to be a ruse. In one swift, bloody night, Ragnar turns the trap on Horik. The king is killed, and Ragnar takes his place, not just as Jarl of Kattegat, but as the most powerful Viking in the land. With Horik gone and Kattegat secured, Ragnar is no longer a simple farmer-turned-warrior. He's a king in all but name, commanding loyalty, fear, and awe. But the cost has been high. He's lost his wife, his brother's trust, and a part of himself. And Ragnar knows that to survive, the Vikings must change too. The world was changing, and Ragnar knew that change would not wait. With Kattegat thriving under his rule, he began looking outward once again, not just for lands to raid, but for lands to claim. He no longer dreamed only of glory through blood, but of legacy through permanence. Ragnar wanted his people to settle, to grow, to leave behind more than just myths and sagas. This ambition led him back to Wessex, where he forged a fragile alliance with King Ecbert. The two rulers, vastly different in culture and faith, found mutual respect in each other's vision. Ecbert offered fertile land for Viking settlers in exchange for military aid. Ragnar agreed, sending a group of Norse farmers including Lagertha to establish a colony. It felt like a beginning, but trust is dangerous in a world of kings. Playing a double game, betrayed the settlers. He allowed them to be slaughtered by another Saxon lord while keeping his hands clean. Ragnar, unaware of the massacre, continued to believe peace was possible. But in Wessex, peace was always a shadow beneath a sword. Changes stirred. Bjorn had returned, older, stronger, colder. He carried the silent weight of being Ragnar's son and the pressure of living up to that name. Ragnar hoped to mold him into a future leader, but Bjorn's path was his own. Forged not by Ragnar's legacy, but by his own rage, pain, and pride. Meanwhile, Floki drifted into darkness. Obsessed with the gods, he believed Ragnar had turned his back on their faith, especially by keeping Athelstan close. Athelstan, torn between his old Christian beliefs and the Norse ways, had become a brother to Ragnar, a trusted advisor, and perhaps his truest friend. But Floki could not accept the presence of a Christian at Ragnar's side. It felt like betrayal, like poison in the blood of their gods. One night, driven by divine fury and jealous devotion, Floki murdered Athelstan. It was quiet, brutal, and final. The pain Ragnar felt was not loud. It was silent and deep. A part of him died with Athelstan, but he did not retaliate. Instead of punishment, Ragnar gave Floki distance and silence. It was worse than death. Ragnar's grief sharpened his resolve. He turned his gaze to Parisa, city spoken of in whispers, said to be impenetrable, filled with treasures and defended by rivers and walls. To conquer Paris would be to prove Viking supremacy. It would cement Ragnar's legacy. The preparations were massive. Hundreds of ships, thousands of warriors. He formed uneasy alliances again with King Ecbert and gathered his war council. Rollo Lagertha, Flokich, brought power, but also instability. Trust was thin. Ragnar's will drove them forward. When the Viking fleet reached the shores of Francia, they were met with a sight unlike any before. Massive walls. Armies prepared, siege after siege failed. The Franks held their ground. Ragnar, wounded and weakened, saw defeat on the horizon. But then came one of his greatest deceptions. He faked his death. A coffin, a Christian funeral, an offer to bury him inside the city. The Franks accepted, unaware that within the coffin the war still lived. Ragnar rose, alive, and opened the gates from within. The Vikings flooded in. The siege succeeded not through brute strength, but cunning. Even in triumph, victory tasted bitter. Paris remained intact, and Ragnar's body and spirit were broken. He returned to Kattegat, leaving Rollo in charge in Francia, a decision that would haunt him. Rollo, tired of being the forgotten brother, betrayed Ragnar. He stayed in Paris, married a Frankish princess, and swore loyalty to the emperor. The ultimate betrayal. Years passed, Ragnar vanished. His legend faded into whispers. But in the shadows he watched, waiting. Knowing that the storm he began was not yet over, but in the shadows he watched, waiting. Knowing that the storm he began was not yet over. Years had passed since Ragnar disappeared from Kattegat. Rumors of his death had spread across the Norse world. Some believed he had sailed west and never returned. Others said the gods had taken him. But the truth was far more human. Ragnar had vanished. Not to die, but to reflect. His kingdom had grown without him. Sons had become men. And the world he had helped shape no longer had a place for him. When he finally returned, ragged and older, the people of Kattegat were stunned. He was no longer the fearless warrior king who had led them across oceans. He was a broken, man-tired, quiet, and burdened by the ghosts of the past. His first words upon returning were not of war or glory, but of shame. He confessed his failure to avenge the settlers in Wessex, and many of his followers turned away in silence. But Ragnar had not come back for forgiveness. He had come back to finish what he started. Sons were now the future. Bjorn, strong and respected, prepared for his own great journey exploration beyond the Mediterranean. Ebbsfritzerk, Sigurd, and Ivar were growing restless, each shaped by their mother Aslog's pride and Ragnar's legacy. Among them, Ivar stood apart. Crippled from birth, yet sharper than any blade, Ivar was driven by rage and brilliance. Ragnar saw it in his eyes, the same hunger he once had. Ragnar chose Ivar to accompany him to England. It was a dangerous journey, one that had no promise of return. Ragnar's plan was clear. He would provoke King Ecbert, force him to kill him, and unleash his sons upon the Saxon kingdoms. It was not revenge he sought, it was a spark to ignite the fury of the next generation. Their voyage was small, almost suicidal. Single ship. No army. They arrived in Wessex like ghosts from the past. Ecbert, now older and more cunning, welcomed Ragnar with surprise and caution. The two men, enemies and equals, shared long conversations about gods, legacy, and death. Ragnar confessed he no longer believed in the gods the way he once did. Ecbert admitted his betrayal. It was a meeting of two tired lions, wary, wise, and near their end. Eventually, Ragnar asked Ecbert to deliver him to King El of Northumbria, knowing the brutal death that awaited him. Ecbert obliged, washing his hands of guilt by allowing another king to carry out the execution. Ragnar was tortured, mocked, and finally thrown into a pit of snakes. But he did not die as a man, he died as a myth. His final words echoed with defiance, invoking Odin and foretelling the vengeance of his sons. News of Ragnar's death spread like wildfire. Back in Kattegat, his sons were shattered. Ivar returned with fire in his blood. Bjorn, hardened by his own conquests, took command, together with their brothers and warriors from across the Norse lands. They formed the great heathen army, the largest Viking force the world had ever seen. Their target, England. Meanwhile, Lagertha had seized power in Kattegat. She killed Aslog and declared herself queen, reawakening old rivalries and setting the stage for future conflict. But the true storm was now heading west. The sons of Ragnar were coming not as raiders, but as conquerors. The great heathen army stormed the shores of England like a thunderclap. It wasn't just a raid, it was vengeance given form, led by the sons of Ragnar Bjorn, Ivar, Ub, Svitserk. Sigurd the army stretched across the land like a tide, consuming everything in its path. Among the brothers, one figure stood in the center of the storm. Ivar the Boneless. Cruel, brilliant, and fearless, Ivar quickly asserted his dominance. He was not merely fighting a war, he was rewriting what it meant to be a Viking. Where others charged with axes, Ivar strategized like a predator. Where others sought glory, he sought absolute domination. He burned villages, outwitted kings, and punished those who had betrayed his father. Their first target was King El, the man who executed Ragnar. The vengeance was brutal. El was captured and subjected to the Blood Eagle, a ritual execution reserved for the worst enemies. As El screamed in agony, Ivar watched without emotion. His father had been avenged, but the war had only begun. Next came King Ecbert. Though older and weaker, he remained a master manipulator. He handed over his crown to his son before facing the Vikings. Ecbert's death was not as bloody as El's, but it was perhaps more tragic. A once great king dying with the weight of betrayal still fresh in his soul. Back in Kattegat, Lagertha's rule was growing unstable. She had claimed the throne by killing Aslog, Ragnar's second wife and the mother of Ivar. That act had planted a seed of vengeance in Ivar's heart. Even as he conquered Wessex, his eyes remained on Kattegat. But cracks began to show among the brothers. Sigurd, bold but reckless, clashed constantly with Ivar. He challenged Ivar's cruelty, mocked his disability, and refused to bow. The tension finally exploded when Ivar, consumed by rage, killed Sigurd with an axe during an argument. Their bond as brothers shattered in an instant, blood soaking the floor. Ub, once close to Ivar, began to drift. He sought something different, honor, unity, even peace. His vision for the Viking future no longer aligned with Ivar's brutality. Began to crumble under the pressure. Meanwhile, Bjorn Ironside carved his own path, refusing to be bound by Ivar's shadow. He sailed across the Mediterranean, fighting in Sicily and North Africa. He met emperors, faced betrayal, and proved that he was more than just Ragnar's son. He was a warrior of legend in his own right. But glory came at a cost. The more they conquered, the more they lost themselves. The dream that Ragnar once had for a future beyond blood was fading. Back in the north, Kattegat became the next battlefield. Ivar, now calling himself a god, returned with a massive force to claim the throne from Lagertha. What followed was a brutal siege, brother against brother, gods against fate. Ivar's army, fueled by his iron will, overwhelmed the city. Lagertha, a shield maiden to the end, fought with fire in her soul, but the odds were impossible. Kattegat fell. Ivar had won. He declared himself king of Kattegat, not just a warrior, but a ruler. But in his eyes burned something darker. This wasn't leadership. Its reign had begun, but so had his descent. Ivar had won. He declared himself king of Kattegat, not just a warrior, but a ruler. but in his eyes burned something darker. This wasn't leadership, it was tyranny. Ivar ruled Kattegat like a god-king draped in gold, surrounded by silent fear. The once proud city turned cold and quiet under his command. Where Ragnar had ruled with a dream, Ivar ruled with dread. Public executions became spectacles. Walls were covered with the blood of those who whispered rebellion. No one was safe, not nobles, not warriors, not even family. His obsession with power twisted his soul. He claimed visions from the gods guided him. He declared himself a descendant of Odin. But behind his thrones and declarations, he was alone, surrounded by ghosts and shadows. His brother had become hollow. Once a fierce warrior, he now wandered the halls of Kattegat like a drunk spirit, drinking to silence the voices in his mind. Visions of Sigurd slain by Ivar haunted him. He saw flames in every corner. He was trapped between guilt and loyalty. Ivar watched him not with concern, but control. He needed Hifitsirk broken, a puppet, a reminder. But even tyranny has its limits. Far across the sea, Ub, disillusioned with the endless cycle of vengeance, left everything behind. He sailed west with Torvi in a small group, guided only by stories Ragnar once told, tales of golden lands, untouched and vast. They landed in Iceland, but the land was hard. Winds screamed across black rock, crops failed, hope faded. And when they found Floki, he was barely a man, rambling, broken, searching for gods that never spoke. Ub saw something no other son of Ragnar had grasped yet. The Viking way was dying. It's not by sword, but by time. The world was changing. Raiding and conquest could no longer sustain them. A new legacy was needed, one not forged by war, but by survival. Meanwhile, Bjorn Ironside, wandering across continents, was hailed as a living legend. He walked among caliphs and kings, survived betrayals in Sicily, and raised fleets in unknown lands. His legend grew, but so did the call to return home. Reports reached him of Ivar's madness, of Kattegat drenched in blood, of a legacy turned upside down. He returned not as a conqueror, but as a redeemer. His arrival stirred the people. Torches lit the mountains. Old warriors sharpened their swords. Kattegat would rise, not for revenge, but for rebirth. Bjorn stood tall, the mirror opposite of Ivar. Calm, strong, silent. Ivar prepared for war. He built traps, walls, and alliances of fear. He declared that the gods would smite all who defied him. But inside, he was crumbling. The man who once burned England now feared his own shadow. When the final battle came, it was not just steel against steel. It was brother against brother, dream against nightmare. Bjorn led the charge like a storm. Ivar, ever the strategist, countered with merciless precision. Arrows rained, fire burned. Screams filled the forests. And in the chaos, a Hifitsirk chose. His soul shattered, his heart numb. He turned his blade on Ivar, his brother, his tormentor. The moment their eyes met, time seemed to stop. No words, no screams, just blood and silence. Ivar fled, wounded, defeated, not just in body, but in spirit. Bjorn took the throne. People hailed him not as a king, but as a hope reborn. But Bjorn knew the price had been too high. He stood alone. Oh, Ragnar. No unity, just ash and echoes. Far away, Up finally reached distant shores lush, green, untouched. A new world. Perhaps even Vinland. As he stepped onto the land, he looked to the horizon not as a raider, but as a settler. A new path, a new beginning. And as the waves crashed against the old Viking ships, one truth became clear. The gods were silent. The old world was ending. And the saga of Ragnar's sons was nearing its final verse. The gods were silent. The old world was ending. and the saga of Ragnar's sons was nearing its final verse. Ivar, the boneless, disappeared into the shadows, wounded not only in body, but in legacy. His dream of godhood had shattered. His brothers had turned on him. His people had rejected him. And in the silence that followed his fall, he wandered not as a king, but as a ghost. While he faded into myth, Bjorn Ironside ruled Kattegat. But the victory that placed him on the throne also burdened him with endless weight. The people saw in him the return of Ragnar's spirit. Yet Bjorn knew he was no longer just a son or a hero. He was the final hope of a dying age. Peace returned to the land, but beneath it, the earth trembled with unfinished wars and restless hearts. News soon reached the north. New enemies were rising. The Rus Vikings, led by Prince Oleg, were coming armed with faith, armies, and ice-cold ruthlessness. Their mission was not simply to conquer, but to claim the soul of Norway, and with them was Ivar. Rescued and restored by the Rus, Ivar had returned from the abyss. But something had changed. He was colder now, wiser, less a tyrant, more a tactician. His madness had narrowed into focus, and this time, he would not fight alone. Prince Oleg, a zealous Christian warlord, saw Kattegat as a key to reshaping the Norse world. Ivar, always the opportunist, aligned with him. Together, they formed a terrifying alliance-iron discipline mixed with strategic genius. Their goal, crush Bjorn, break the Norse pagan spirit, and claim the North once and for all. Bjorn, though outnumbered, did not retreat. He stood tall on the cliffs of Norway, looking down at the sea of sails approaching. He knew he was not just fighting for Kattegat, but for everything the Vikings had ever stood for: freedom, God's honor, legacy. As war erupted, the battle was unlike any before. Massive, bloody, cold winds howled as sword met shield. The Rus overwhelmed the Vikings, their formations ruthless and mechanical. In the chaos, Bjorn rode alone, his armor gleaming, rallying warriors who were ready to flee. And then he was struck. A blade pierced him. His horse fell. Silence. Word spread. Bjorn Ironside was dead. But the gods were not finished with him. Days later, the Rus army lined the shores again. A lone figure appeared on horseback. It was Bjorn, pale, bloodied, barely alive, but standing. With sword in hand, he raised it to the sky. The Viking warriors behind him roared to life. It was not a trick. It was defiance made flesh. And in that moment, even death could not silence Bjorn Ironside. He died soon after, but not before turning the tide of battle. His courage lit a fire that his enemies could not extinguish. The Rus faltered. God King Ivar watched as Bjorn's myth was born right before him. The war raged on, and soon Ivar's final hour came. He had returned to the battlefield, marching with H.V. Cirque one last time. The two surviving brothers of Ragnar. One broken by visions. One broken by ambition. Ivar, knowing he could not win, marched anyway. Not for conquest, but for a warrior's end. He was surrounded by enemy soldiers. With no fear, he told them he was unarmed. They hesitated, till one drove a blade into his belly. There were no screams, no rage. Ivar looked down at the wound, almost surprised. He fell to his knees and smiled, whispering softly, "Don't be afraid." H.V. Cirque collapsed beside him, sobbing. Ivar the Boneless, the most feared of Ragnar's sons, died not on a throne or in a blaze of glory, but quietly in the dirt, beside his brother. He had lived as a terror, but died as a man. The age of Ragnar's sons was ending. In Iceland, Oop stood on distant shores, watching the sunrise over a new world. He had reached Vinland lush, untouched, and wild. The past no longer chased him. There were no kings, no blood feuds, no gods demanding sacrifice, only peace and the sound of waves. Back in the north, the old gods were fading. Christianity spread like wind over a dying fire. Temples became ruins. Long ships rotted on cold beaches. The sagas were now stories told by firelight to children who no longer believed, and legends never truly die. The story of Ragnar Lothbrok and the fierce, broken, brilliant sons he left behind would echo through history. They had sailed beyond the edge of the world. They had defied kings and gods. They had carved their names into the bones of time. And though the Viking Age was gone, its fire would burn forever. The battlefield was silent. Even the crows had flown away, leaving the field empty except for two figures. One was sprawled on the ground, his face contorted in a silent scream, his armor, once gleaming, now dull, mirroring the bleak sky. Ivar the Boneless, the terror of England, the bane of Northumbria, whose name had struck fear into the hearts of kings, was dead. His blue eyes, usually sharp with cunning, were vacant, staring sightlessly at the clouds. A single drop of blood trickled down his chin, a stark red against the gray of death. Beside him knelt another figure, his head bowed, shoulders shaking. It was Hvitserk, Ivar's brother, the last of the great army, the final echo of the legendary Viking horde. His hands, stained crimson, clutched at Ivar's tunic, his face buried in the crook of his brother's armor. "Ivar," he whispered, his voice hoarse with grief and despair. But there was no response, only the sigh of the wind through the long grass and the distant cry of a lone bird. When Hvitserk lifted his head, his face was streaked with dirt and tears. His blue eyes, identical to Ivar's, were filled with an endless sadness. All around him lay the bodies of their comrades, their dreams, their hopes, their fury. This wasn't just a battle, it was a massacre. Ivar, in his arrogance, had led them into a trap, and now they had paid the price. He looked at Ivar, his twin, his friend, his enemy, and felt nothing but sorrow. In the last moments, Ivar had turned to him, his face pale, his voice weak. "Hvitserk," he had rasped, "brother, I have failed." And then he had looked away, unable to bear the shame, the disappointment, the echoes of their father's legacy. The burden of a name that had become synonymous with conquest, with blood, with the relentless pursuit of power. As he stayed there kneeling, the realization washed over him, cold and heavy like a shroud. He was the last. There were no more battles to fight, no more victories to claim, no more legends to forge. He was alone. Back in Kattegat, a chill wind swept across the docks, carrying with it the scent of salt and death. The news of Ivar's demise had arrived on the wings of the north wind, swift and merciless. The people of Kattegat, a mix of Vikings and Christians, stood in small groups, their faces grim, their voices hushed. For some, the news brought relief, a release from the shadow of the Raven Banner. For others, it meant the end of an era, the passing of a bloodline that had ruled and ravaged for generations. Lagertha, her face lined with worry, stood beside the shore, her gaze fixed on the churning sea. She remembered the day Ragnar had set sail with his band of brothers, and the day they returned, their ships laden with tales and treasures. She remembered the pride, the joy, the fear that had been their constant companion. And now she stood watching the slow death of their legacy. Inside the longhouse, Astrid, her silver hair gleaming, sat with King Yuba and Torvi. They had returned from England, their faces drawn, their eyes haunted. The loss of Ivar hung heavy between them, a silent specter that chilled the room. Astrid looked at Yuba, the last king of the north, and saw the weight of his crown pressing down on him. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The people of Kattegat slowly began to rebuild, to plant crops, to mend homes, to make merry. Life, as it always did, went on. But the shadow of the past lingered, a ghost in the bustling marketplace, a whisper in the evening breeze. The Viking Age was ending, not with a roar, but with a whimper. News of Ivar's death reached England like a funeral dirge carried on the winds of the North Sea. King El, his face etched with the lines of hard-won victories, stood in the courtyard of his hall, gazing at the banners of Northumbria snapping in the wind. He had fought against Ivar, against Ragnar, against the best of the Viking horde, and he knew their strength, their relentlessness, their thirst for vengeance. He remembered the first attack, the shock of seeing longships cutting through the waves, the terror in his men's faces as the Vikings descended upon them like a storm. He remembered the battles, the blood, the clash of steel, the agony of defeat. And he remembered Ivar, his cunning smile, his cruel eyes, the way he had held Eäl's son hostage, dangling the boy's life like a bargaining chip. But now Ivar was gone, killed in a pit of his own design, and a strange sense of emptiness settled over El. Part of him, the warrior part, had wanted the fight, the chance to prove himself against the greatest of the Norsemen. But now, with Ivar dead, a part of him wished for just one more battle, a last hurrah against a worthy foe. But that was impossible. The Viking Age was dying, and with it, the spirit of adventure, of exploration, of unconquerable courage was ebbing away like the tide. Deep in the forests of northern England, deep in a place where sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy, lived a man named Sihtric. He was an old man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his hair white as snow, his eyes filled with the wisdom of ages. He had been a monk when Ragnar had come to York, a witness to the brutality and the camaraderie, the violence and the humanity of the Viking hordes. When Ragnar had shown him the map, a map that spoke of lands beyond imagination, Sihtric had felt a spark of excitement, a longing for adventure. But he had stayed, choosing the familiar comfort of his monastery over the allure of the unknown. And now, years later, he was paying the price for that decision. The news of Ivar's death had reached him on the wings of the wind, and he had felt a pang of sympathy for the young king. A reminder of Ragnar's son, a reflection of the potential that had been lost to ambition and pride. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Sihtric sat in his small hut, a book in his lap, his eyes closed. He thought of Ragnar, of Ivar, of all the men he had known, the good, the bad, the violent, the curious. He thought of the Viking Age, an age of exploration, of conquest, of dreams that had dared to touch the stars. He opened his eyes, the fire in his heart rekindled. The Viking Age might be ending, but the spirit of adventure, the thirst for knowledge, the desire to explore that was eternal, far across the sea in the icy waters of the north, Floki traveled in his small boat, his face weathered, his eyes distant. He was an old man now, his hair and beard flowing behind him like white streamers, his body bent with age and hardship. He had sailed these seas for most of his life, exploring, trading, fighting. He had discovered new lands, new people, new ways of life. He had been to Vinland, to the shores of North America, where the trees grew tall and the land was rich with promise. He had seen the beauty of the world and the cruelty of men. He had sailed with Ragnar, with Ivar, with all the legendary heroes of the Viking Age, and now he was sailing alone, his mind filled with memories, his heart heavy with loss. As the boat cut through the waves, he thought of the gods, of Odin, of Thor, of all the deities of the old ways. He wondered if they were real, or if they were just stories that men had told to make sense of the world. He thought of the temples, the great halls where men had gathered to sacrifice and to pray, and he wondered if they would ever be anything more than ruins. Floki shook his head, clearing away the thoughts. It didn't matter whether the gods were real or not. What mattered was the journey, the search, the quest for meaning in a world that seemed to have none. And so he sailed on, guided by the stars, driven by an insatiable curiosity, hoping to find, if not the gods, then at least a glimpse of the truth. As the Viking Age drew to a close, the old ways, the old stories, the old dreams began to fade. But in the hearts and minds of men they remained, echoes in the vast emptiness of the north. Ub, his face lined with fatigue and sorrow, stood at the edge of the cliff overlooking the sea. He was alone. His brothers were dead, his companions scattered. His purpose, his reason for living, had died with Ivor in that god-forsaken pit. Looked out at the endless expanse of water, the horizon blurred, the sky gray and heavy. The wind whipped at his cloak, carrying with it the scent of salt and rain. He remembered the stories his father had told him of far-off lands, of adventures and riches beyond imagination. He remembered how his father had returned with tales of exotic people and customs, of lands that flowed with honey and milk, and how they had all looked up to him, their young hearts filled with wonder and awe. He remembered the raids, the battles, the victories. He remembered his brothers, their laughter, their rivalries, their camaraderie. He remembered the hope that had burned brightly in Ivor's eyes when they had set sail for England, the belief that they could conquer even death itself. And now he was here, at the end, with nothing but the ghosts of the past and the endless sea stretching before him, reflecting the emptiness in his soul. Ub took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, trying to find a reason to go on, to keep living in a world that had lost its meaning. He thought of Torvi, of his son, of the life he had built in England. He thought of his father, of the legacy he had left behind. Slowly, he turned away from the cliff. His shoulders slumped, his eyes filled with a deep, quiet sadness. The Viking Age was over, but the stories, the memories, the dreams, they would live on, carried on the wings of the wind, echoing in the hearts of men. For as long as there were people who dared to dream of far-off lands, the Viking spirit would endure.